Virtue. And this little workshop is being organized in collaboration with Areiopagi at the University of Helsinki, and it's being funded by Sir John Templeton Foundation. So our greetings go to Sir John for all his money that he's given to all of us. If I would try to count all the hamburgers that I've had on the expense of Sir John, I wouldn't be able to count them because there are just too many. So our thanks go to Sir John. I'm a university researcher here at the University of Helsinki. I'm one of the main organizers, so if you have any questions or practical issues, you can come to talk to me or Miikka over there, and I will be directing you over the day. So without further ado, let's begin with Teemu Pauha, who's a psychologist, and he works here at the University of Helsinki as a university lecturer in the study of religion, and he's specialized in religious identity and group formation and various other things that he will now tell us about. Thank you, Teemu.
Hey. Thank you, Aku. Thank you, organizers. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here this morning. As Aku just told you, my name is Teemu Pauha. By background, my background is in psychology and study of religion. I'm an associate professor in the study of religion at the University of Turku, and as said, a university lecturer in Islamic theology here. What I'm going to be talking today are some of the basics of intergroup relations and how religious identity plays a role in them. And identity is a tricky concept because it's used in all kinds of fields. All disciplines talk of identity, from mathematics to gender studies and from sociology to political science. And in all those fields, the term identity means completely different things. And the framework in which I am discussing identity here this morning is what is sometimes called social identity approach, which is kind of an umbrella term sometimes used of social identity theory, and some other theories developed on the basis of it, most notably self-categorization theory. Sometimes social identity theory itself is used as an umbrella term to refer to both original social identity theory proper and then all of its later developments. Basically, when psychologists talk of identity, they usually mean something in some way or another. They mean by it an answer that someone gives to the question of who he or she is. And what is important for social identity approach is especially the distinction between personal identity and social identity. And personal identity are those aspects of myself that make me unique. Those aspects of my selfhood that distinguish me from everyone else. Whereas social identity are the things that make me unlike others. So to use a classical definition by the grand old men of social identity theory, Henry Touchfell and John Turner, from their original work in 1979, social identity refers to those aspects of an individual self-image that derive from the social categories to which he or she perceives himself as belonging. That is, social identity is about my feeling of being a member of certain social categories and also the meanings that I attribute to those category memberships. We all have a personal identity and we all have a range of social identities because we all belong to a range of different social categories. But that does not mean that they all are equally active at the same time. Just the opposite. So social identities become active in social interaction. And also personal identities become active in social interaction. That is, depending on a social interaction or the social situation in which I find myself in, I may experience myself and the person with whom I'm interacting first and foremost as individuals. A typical example of this are friendships or romantic relationships. I think most of us who are in a romantic relationship with someone do not think of ourselves first and foremost being in a relationship with a representative of social category. I'm married to a Finn. But to be in a relationship with a certain specific individual, the most important thing is who she or he is as an individual and not whether he or she is a representative of a certain social category. At the other end of the continuum are interactions in which we feel ourselves and the other people as representing first and foremost certain social categories. And textbook examples of this are sport competitions and war. In a situation of war, people typically don't feel that they are shooting each other because of how they are as individuals. I really hate that guy and therefore I want to shoot that. But because of them representing some other, some social category that is seen as being a conflict with one's own social category to which oneself is belonging. For example, being of a different nationality. And in fact, waging a war becomes a lot more difficult if we think of the of the opponents as being a bunch of individuals instead of being a group of people belonging to some enemy nationality or some other social category. So, identities become active in situations, in interaction, and they range on a continuum from interpersonal to intergroup. And because we all have a range of social identities, because we all are members of a range of social categories, there are a lot of situational and other factors that affect whether we experience a given social interaction as an interpersonal one or as an intergroup one, and if the latter, which is the social identity that is active in this said situation. The factors that affect this are, well, situational accessibility. That means certain situations tend to make certain social identities active. When being here, it's kind of, because of the situation, it's kind of a natural that I'm here speaking first and foremost as an academic and not so much as a father or as a martial artist or as a beer enthusiast or what have you. Another thing is what is called chronic accessibility, which means that certain identities are, that different individuals have different identities that are central to their self-conception. A kind of banal example that I've sometimes used is that one would expect that, for example, for an archbishop, Lutheran identity would be kind of a central issue of his or her self-conception, and therefore something that is likely to become active in a range of different situations. People differ on which social identities are central to their self-conception. And then there are two other factors that have to do with the intergroup composition of the situation. And they are called comparative and normative fit. And what this means is that, what is meant by comparative fit is that social identity tends to become active if the kind of intergroup composition in which I find myself in, there is some kind of an easy at hand group distinction that I can easily notice that I can use as the basis of a structure in the situation. One example that many people know is this experience of feeling the national identity the strongest when being abroad. Many people say that they feel the most Finnish when being outside of Finland. There's this easy at hand group distinction that can be used to structure the situation. And normative fit, in contrast, refers to meanings attributed to category membership. So if we attribute to category membership that is somehow relevant in the situation, a distinction in kind of that we see the groups that are present, we see them as entailing meanings that are really far from each other on some important dimension of comparison, then also the social identity is likely to become active. I've tried to think of an example of comparative and normative fit from my own example and from my own life, and the best example that I've come up with is an experience I had something like 15 years ago when I was as an Erasmus student in Germany. I was living in a flat that I shared with 11 other people, and one night a couple of friends of mine were visiting me from Finland, and we were having a good time the Finnish way, so we sat in our shared kitchen and we had all the lights off and we were playing some really gloomy music, some kind of Finnish metal music or something like that, and we're drinking beer and we're sitting there all silent, and then my flatmates came into the kitchen. They were rather shocked and wondering whether we were contemplating suicide or something like that. Wanted to put all the lights on and then put on some cheery music, Red Hot Chili Peppers, I think it was. And we were upset that our perfectly good Finnish time of spending the night was ruined. But the social identity, Finnish identity, immediately came active because there was this kind of an easy to recognize difference, that there were us, the native Finnish speakers who live normally in Finland, sitting in the kitchen, and then the Germans coming over, and then also this kind of that has to do with the comparative fit, and then also this idea of Finns being melancholic and gloomy and liking gloomy music and liking metal music, also that also being involved, so that also played a role in the Finnish national identity becoming active in that situation. To further introduce to you some key concepts, I'd like to say a few words about in-group and out-group, which are, well, in-group is us. It's the people that we are seeing as representing the same social category that I myself am a member of. And out-group are then the others. And what is important to know is that because different social identities are active in different situations, also the boundaries of in-group and out-group change depending on the situation. Again, to use a somewhat banal example, we have here a completely imaginary person, Teemu, a Finnish university lecturer, who might be in an academic conference in which the professional identity is active. And then the people who share the same professional identity, the Swedish researcher, they are members of the in-group, whereas those who don't share the same professional identity, for example, Finnish taxi drivers, they are the out-group. But if Teemu is watching the Eurovision context, then the national identity is likely to be active. Then suddenly the Swedish researchers, they belong to the out-group, whereas the Finnish taxi drivers, they are the in-group. So us and them, they change depending on the context, depending on the situation. Now, why this is important is that there is a very well-known effect that seems to happen when a social identity becomes active. So whenever people feel that they are in an interaction as members, as representatives of a certain in-group, that seems to lead universally to what is called in-group bias. They start to favor one's in-group. As they say in Finnish, pelata kotiin päin. Start to give preference to one's own in-group over those belonging to out-group. And this does not appear to have anything to do with what kind of the social identity is active. But this can be perceived in experimental studies in which group division is made arbitrarily or randomly, and everyone knows it's arbitrary, where people have been divided into groups based on the color of the shirt or whether they like a certain abstract painting better than the other one. And everyone knows it's an arbitrary division, and still people in-group bias is visible in those situations. What is also important to note that people quite often kind of understand the in-group bias as referring to, as meaning that we kind of have a natural tendency to favor us and be against the others and kind of and hate the other or be prejudiced against the other. But this doesn't really, this is only half true. So in-group bias doesn't necessarily mean out-group derogation. So favoring in-group doesn't necessarily mean active dislike or active hatred or anything like that towards the other. I think also here a good example that many might feel is patriotism. Many people feel that they can be proud of their own country, they can wish for their own country to win in Eurovision contest or ice hockey, for example, without this meaning that they actively want the other countries to fail, that they kind of actively want harm to happen to other people or other countries. On the basis of research, state of the art, it appears that in-group bias is universal. So that happens regardless of what group membership is active in the situation, whereas out-group derogation, that seems to be situational. So whether in-group bias translates into actively wanting harm to happen to the other group, that depends on situational factors, the most important of which is threat, experience of threat. And this might be either referred to a very concrete threat, that the other group is perceived as being a threat to our livelihood or our lives or our health or whatever, or this might refer to symbolic threat, so that the other group is perceived as being a threat to our culture or our value system or our way of life or something like that. But if social identity activation is coupled with an experience of intergroup threat, then that is likely to translate also to, besides in-group bias, also out-group hate or out-group derogation. Because in-group bias seems to be a universal consequence of identifying oneself with a social category, as I said, we see that in minimal group experiments in which the group division is random or arbitrary and everyone knows it's such. Therefore, most attempts to alleviate intergroup conflict are based on either an attempt of weakening the intergroup boundary or moving the intergroup boundary. Because it appears that whenever we identify ourselves with a certain social category, that has consequences, at least in group bias. Therefore, the interventions are based on trying to make the intergroup boundary less salient or move it to someplace else. And I'm going to introduce to you a few different kind of abstract principles on which different attempts at reducing intergroup bias have been based on. First of these is what is quite often called Re-Categorization. This refers to an attempt to, if, as I said previously, the interaction situations range on a continuum from interpersonal to intergroup, so we experience certain situations as being encounters between individuals, whereas in other situations we feel ourselves and the other as being representatives of a social category. And therefore, if the situation is experienced as an intergroup one, then there are these kind of universal consequences, in-group bias for starters. Then what I didn't mention, but what are also involved are self-stereotyping and stereotyping of the other, so that we perceive ourselves and the others as more similar to the group stereotype and also act accordingly. But there are these consequences that might be harmful. So therefore, attempt to alleviate the intergroup bias, one way would be to make the situation to be experienced more as an interpersonal one in contrast to an intergroup one. This is something that community mediators or neighborhood mediators do. So when trying to tackle with a conflict in the neighborhood, they don't go there and try to solve out a conflict between Finns and Somalis or what have you, but to work out a conflict between given people living in the same neighborhood. So trying to kind of treat the conflict that is there as a being between individual people instead of being kind of between groups. This seems to be working rather well, but the downside is that the typical consequence is that that the attitudes improve towards the given individual, but not to the given group as a whole. So people then might start to feel that, okay, this Mahmoud is a nice guy, but all the other Muslims, they are terrorists. So the attitudes improve only towards this specific individual. Alternative approach that is sometimes taken is what is called Re-Categorization, which is an attempt to find some kind of an superordinate category, some kind of a larger umbrella identity that would somehow bring together the groups that would otherwise be in conflict. So if we have here two groups, A and B, that have some kind of conflict, then we try to find some superordinate category C that would somehow bring them together. An example to this that is discussed quite a lot in racism literature is to coming up with an inclusive national identity that would somehow that would be open to ethnic variation, ethnic diversity, and would therefore relieve ethnic tensions in the society. The problem with this Re-Categorization approach is that people aren't likely to easily give up their social identities. People don't like being defined from above on how to perceive themselves and others. And especially minorities are particularly prone to resist this, and with good reasons. There are good examples of minority groups being forcefully integrated into broader community. I'm thinking here Sami people or the indigenous people in Canada. So forcefully forced into a certain social category. So I see there are also good reasons, especially with minorities, to resist this kind of a top-down attempt of trying to bring all different groups into society within the boundaries of a superordinate category. And as a potential solution, what is proposed is the dual identity, so that there would be possibilities to identify oneself as that it wouldn't be necessary to either be Finnish or Somali, but one could have a dual identity as a Finnish Somali. And there are also studies that relate to dual identities in the religious context and how these kinds of identity, how these kinds of dual identities might affect interreligious relationships. One good example are the studies done by Jonas Kunst, my colleague from University of Oslo, who has done a lot of research on people's identification with the broader Abrahamic category, besides their other identity as being Jews or Christians or Muslims. So Jonas has conducted research in the States and in Israel-Palestine, studying the extent to which the American Jews and Israeli Jews and Palestinian Muslims identify themselves, besides their own kind of religious community, also with the broader Abrahamic legacy. So with the extent to which they feel that they are representatives of this broader Abrahamic superordinate identity. And the different studies that Jonas and his colleagues have done, I'm here only referencing this one, but there are more that they have done on the same topic. They strongly point to the direction that the extent to which these people, that the respondents in their studies identify themselves as being part of the same Abrahamic legacy, that positively predicts positive intergroup attitudes. So the more people feel that we all are part of the same Abrahamic family, the more positive attitude they seem to have towards each other. Me and my colleagues in social psychology, we then in contrast did a study in which we studied non-believers in 4 different Protestant majority countries, namely Australia, Germany, Finland and Norway. And we here included in our sample were both people who said in our survey that they had never believed in God. They didn't believe in God at the moment when they were taking our survey, but they also hadn't ever had a belief in God. And we called these people lifelong atheists. But we also had a number of people who said that they didn't believe in God the moment when they were taking the survey, but they had believed in God at some other point in their life. And based on on what we know about deconversion on the basis of studies conducted in psychology of religion, we presumed that it is likely that deconversion doesn't appear to be a once and for all shift in one's life. So people very seldomly kind of lose every single aspect of their worldview when deconverting or losing faith and adopt a new identity. But quite often there is something left, some former aspect of one's previous worldview or identity. So we also, in this study of ours, we made the hypothesis that those of our respondents who had previously believed in God, that is the deconverts, they would still be more likely to, at least more likely than the lifelong atheists, to hold some kind of what we called traces of religious identity. And that actually turned out to be true. So what we found out was that the deconverts, they scored higher, or let's say they scored not that low on average on our scale of religious identity as the lifelong atheists did. So they seem to have more commonly some kind of at least some foundation or some traces of a religious identity there. And based on this work in social identity theory and this work done on dual identities and re-categorization, we also hypothesized that the religious identity, traces of religious identity, would make the deconverts, on average, more positive towards religious people than the lifelong atheists. So because they have these some aspects of religious identity left, we presumed that would make them feel more affinity with religious people and therefore also to perceive them more positively. And this is actually what turned out to be the case. So compared to lifelong atheists, the deconverts had, on average, a more positive attitude towards both the religious majority and the religious minorities in general and the Muslims in particular. And what is most interesting is that the difference in attitudes was completely, statistically speaking, completely explained by the difference in religious identity. So we could show statistically that because the former believers, the deconverts, they had on average somewhat higher or somewhat less low religious identity than the lifelong believers, they also, because of that, they also had more positive attitudes towards the religious people. And if we controlled for the difference in religious identity, there was no significant difference in attitudes anymore. Interesting study on the role or the very important role that the group identity and the identity dynamics play in intergroup and especially interreligious conflict is provided by a study done by Belle and Kröger a couple of years back, published in Psychology of Religions and Spirituality, in which they studied Muslims in a number of Muslim majority contexts. So they had a large survey data gathered in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different countries, 7 of which were Muslim majority, and then Russia included were Muslim majority regions from the Russian Federation. And what they were interested in, so this was a representative sample of the population at large. And what they were interested in was how the people answered, how different religious variables would predict the answers that people gave to this question or this item that you see here. So there's one item that has to do with the extent to which one feels that that violence towards civilian targets are justified if one is defending Islam. So you can read the item over there. Bell and Kroger in their study, they were interested in the extent to which different religious variables predict the attitude that the respondents have towards religious violence in defense of Islam. And what they found out was that actually all of the religious variables that they measured correlated positively with the responses given to this item. So the more people felt that their religion is important to them, the more accepting they were towards violence towards civilian targets and so on. Prayer frequency, likewise, mosque attendance frequency, likewise. But in statistical studies, the problem with correlation is that this is only bivariate correlation, so relationship between two variables, but it might well be that there is a what is called third variable that actually explains all the other variables and all the other relationships. Common example, textbook example that is always given in introductory courses on statistics is the correlation between eating ice cream and death by drowning. So the more in the summer, during the summer, the more ice cream is being sold, the more people drown. And of course, one doesn't cause the other, but there is a third variable that explains both of them, and that is the number of warm days. So the warmer the summer, the more people buy ice cream, and the more also people die by drowning. And it might be that here's a similar case, that actually that there is one item that actually correlates with all the other variables. And therefore the kind of relationship between religiosity and acceptance of violence towards civilian targets has to do with a single variable that is causing kind of all the other relationships that we see here. And that was actually what turned out to be the case. So that there was one of these that was only, when everything else was controlled for, there was only one of these that was actually positively associated with acceptance of religious violence, and that was mosque attendance frequency. So the more actively people visited mosques, the more accepting they were towards violence towards civilian targets, especially if mosque attendance was associated with perceived religious suppression, interfaith tension, or interfaith hostility. So the Bell and Kroger don't refer in the article, they don't refer to social identity theory, but this is very much in kind of, the result is perfectly in line with what the social identity theory would predict, that the more people identify themselves, the more active they are in a community, it's likely that the more they identify themselves with the community. And especially if they feel that their community is being threatened. You remember that if identification with a social category is coupled with perceived threat to one social category, then that is likely also to lead to intergroup hostility, and that would seem to be the case here. If mosque attendance was controlled for, then actually personal importance of religion and even fundamentalism, they actually were negatively associated with acceptance of religious violence. So if mosque attendance was held constant, the more people perceived religion to be important in their life, and even the more fundamentalist they were, the less accepting they were to religious violence. And if mosque attendance was controlled for, prayer frequency and Quran reading frequency, they had no relationship whatsoever with the acceptance of religious violence. So the kind of conclusion that Bell and Kroger make on the basis of their studies is that it appears to be this social aspect of religiosity, being identifying with the religious community, that leads people to be willing to defend the religious community, even violently if need be, against perceived threats whereas these personal aspects of religiosity and religious practice, personal importance of religion, religious fundamentalism, prayer frequency, Quran reading frequency, they either have no relationship whatsoever, or they have kind of, have a kind of a protective relationship against religious extremism. This finding is quite in line with what Scott Atran, an anthropologist of religion who has done a lot of field work with groups commonly referred to as terrorists. He has been involved in doing field work with those imprisoned in France on terrorism charges, and also with extremist groups in Afghanistan and Indonesia, for example. And in a book in which he summarizes his findings of his field work, he writes that that I once thought that individual cognition and personal aptitudes, together with the influence of broad socioeconomic factors like markets, media, and means of production, determined most human behavior. Now, I see that friendship and other aspects of small group dynamics, such as raising families or playing on a team together, trump most everything else in moving people through life. Small group dynamics, intimate interacting networks of family, friends, schoolmates, workmates, soccer buddies, and such, were key to the making of terrorists. He actually makes the claim in his book that if we were to screen for potential extremists, it doesn't really, the best way is not to screen for their religious opinions or anything such, but to look at what we know about already identified extremists and look who were playing when they were children in the same soccer team together with them. As a final point in my presentation, I also would like to say a few words about morality, which is one of the key concepts in this seminar of ours. And these are some findings that are not yet published. They are actually currently being reviewed, that me and my social psychologist colleagues of mine have been preparing with the same data that actually we used in the study that I showed previously, but here, besides the non-believers, we also included believers. So in our original sample, we had, besides the non-believers with Protestant background, we also had an equal number of people who identified themselves as Protestant believers, and in this study we included both of them. And what we were interested in this study were attitudes towards, on one hand, the religious outgroup, that is for the non-believers, the believers, and for the believers, the non-believers, and also Muslims. And to measure that, we used what is called feeling thermometer. It's quite commonly used measurement when studying intergroup relations. Then we were also interested in the strength of the religious or non-religious worldview, so how central to one's self-conception it is that one is a believer or non-believer, the worldview. And in addition to that, we also were interested in sense of morality, and actually two kinds of sense of morality. So on one hand, we were interested in what we called personal morality, so the sense that one's own worldview makes oneself a good person. And we distinguished that from what we called in-group moral superiority. That is the sense that we, the believers or the non-believers, are better, morally speaking, than the other religious outgroup. That is the believers for the non-believers and the non-believers for the believers. And our hypothesis was that that the identity as a non-believer or a believer would be positively associated with both of these kinds of senses of both senses of morality. That because we know that sense of morality is an important aspect of identity, we perceive that the more people identified themselves as believers or non-believers, the more they would feel that worldview makes them a better person, and also that the more they would perceive as that category of people as being morally superior to alternative worldviews. So we expected to find a positive relationship between the importance of the worldview and both kinds of sense of morality. Then we also expected to find a relationship between sense of morality and attitudes towards the religious outgroups. And here we expected that these two kinds of morality would have an opposite effect on attitudes towards the other. That we expected that the more people felt that their worldview, non-religious or religious, would make them a better person, we would expected that to have a positive relationship with how they perceived the others. And whereas the more people felt that their own worldview is morally superior to alternative worldviews, we expected that to have a negative relationship with how they perceived the others. So that these two kind of moralities would have an opposite effect. And we had found at least some preliminary support for this idea. So the relationship was in the same direction in all countries. It wasn't statistically significant in all of them, but in the same direction nevertheless. And there were some differences between the non-believer and the believer respondents. But on the whole, the big picture looks that our hypothesis was supported, that the strength of the identification with one's worldview predicted both a sense of personal morality and the sense of in-group moral superiority, but these two kinds of morality had the opposite effect on how they related and perceived the religious outgroup. The more, especially the non-religious people, felt that the non-religious worldview made them a better person, the better attitude they had towards the believers, whereas a sense of being morally superior was in both groups of respondents. It was linked to having a negative perception of the other. Okay, I think I'll close here so that we have some time for questions and discussion. I thank you for your attention, and now I think we have something like 10 minutes, a little bit more to discuss. So please, if you have any comments or questions.
We started a bit late, so we can go over a little bit, and there's some time for, there's plenty of time for lunch. Okay. So I'll keep track of time.
Fair enough. Yep. So if anyone has any comments or questions, then I'll welcome them. Aku, please.
Well, I'll just start. So, two questions. First, what do you mean by identity being active? So, by that definition, one would also say that an identity can be passive. So is this? How do you measure whether an identity is active or passive? What does that mean? Is that something that you just ask the person, or something like that? So it's whether those ideas of myself are in the spotlight of my consciousness, or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that what's going on? And that's the question number one. Question number two is that identity here seems to be what you call self-identity, right? But can you be wrong about your identity? So are there sets of facts that have to do with your actual identity versus the identity that you think that you have? So because it seems to me that there's always the possibility of being wrong, and there's a set of facts that pertains to your being identified in a specific way without your knowing it, or something like that. So there's the objective question of identity, and then there's the question of how one construes one's self-identity, which might be kind of all sorts of wrong.
Yeah, very good questions. Starting with the identity being active. So, I actually try to answer. I'll give some kind of an answer to both of those at the same time. So, as said, the identity, even in psychology, refers, depending on the approach, a number of different things. So, when it comes to social identity theory, it means one's own self-image that is based on social categories, and that is also kind of the underlying assumption of what are the social identities, kind of ontologically speaking, is that they are representations that are stored in our long-term memory. So we have in our long-term memory a sense that I'm a member of this category, and I have memories and meanings that are associated with that category, and the long-term memory might become active in a certain context. So it's there, but I'm not paying attention to it at all times. Like I'm not, like my other things that are stored in my long-term memory. I don't actively think of my childhood memories at any given moment, but they might become active in a certain situation in which I'm actively trying to think of them, or that I'm somehow reminded of them, or something like that. So that's the idea, basically idea that identity become active means that it's brought into my consciousness, it's brought into my attention that I'm member of this social category, and that involves certain meanings. One key idea and key concept, especially in this related theory, self-categorization theory, that I did not discuss, and that I did not discuss, but that Katri may discuss later on, is prototype. That also we have this, similar to cognitive prototypes of all kinds of things. I have a prototype of what it means to be a member of a given category. I have an idea, some set of fuzzy set of attributes, as the self-categorization theorists say, of what it means to be a Finn or Muslim or Christian or whatever. And whenever a social identity becomes active, that is, I'm kind of the category membership is brought into my attention. What is also activated in my long-term memory is this prototype of the category membership that starts to then structure the interaction, so that I perceive the other people as representing as being alike to this category, this prototype, and also the members of my other group. That's a different thing. The social identity activation is a different thing to social identity centrality, which would mean kind of the which would mean kind of how important or relevant, because the idea here is that social identity is kind of on one aspect. It's one part of one's self-image, but it might be a big or a small part. So certain social identities might not play such a big role for who I perceive myself to be. Certain aspects of my certain social categories might be rather irrelevant for my overall sense of self, whereas other social identities might be very, very central. So, and this also has to do with this, what I call the chronic accessibility of the social identity. That people vary on how important their any given social identity is for their overall self-conception, and that also depends on how likely these different social identities are to become active in any given situation. Then to one being wrong about one's social identity. So I don't think it's kind of, I don't know whether it would make sense in the context of social identity theory to speak of social identity, one being wrong with one's identity, because after all, it's one's own representation of oneself that becomes active, and whether that's a realistic perception or perception that is similar to how the other people perceive me or not, that's not really perhaps a relevant question to social identity in the context of social identity theory. Of course, in other approaches in psychology, that is very relevant question. So alternative stream in social psychology, quite often referred to as social constructionist psychology or discursive psychology or something similar, conceives of identity quite differently. So whereas in social identity theory, identities are conceived as being these mental representations that are activated from long-term memory or not, in discursive psychology, the identities are conceived as interactional processes. They are not something that are inside myself, they are not inside my long-term memory, but they take place between us. So, in terms of social identity, in terms of social construction, social identity, for example, me having a psychologist identity or an academic identity, it's not something that I carry with me from one situation to another, but that is something that we create here. So me being an academic, that comes true by me being here and speaking to, and you there listening and all attentively on what I'm speaking and so on and so forth. And therefore also there what is important is this aspect of identity negotiation, that I might offer to you some perception of myself, that I might here try to act all academic, but you then have also the power to kind of participate in the negotiation. Because the identity is co-constructed, you might kind of reject the academic identity that I'm trying to offer of myself. So in that kind of a theoretical framework, I think this kind of one being wrong or of one's identity might make more sense as a question. I don't know if I understood. Ansbert, what you asked?
Okay, thanks. This was actually quite helpful for my own work, and my question is more on the side of philosophy than sociology. A little bit of background. I'm currently working on the notion of original sin and responsibility. And secular versions of original sin have to do with the ideas how we become, or how do we participate in some harm that some other people do. And I was wondering whether there is research or discussion in sociology on how do we join different identities, and also can we denounce the identities? For example, let's say that Finland decides to invade Sweden, but for some reason I, as a Finn, don't like the idea, and I said I don't support this illegal war to invade Sweden. So what happens? So let's say that 80% of Finns are in favor of the war with Sweden. But I decided that, okay, I'm against it. I'm ashamed that I'm a Finn. So what happens from a sociological perspective? And can we get rid of this kind of I mean, this is more philosophical question.
Yeah.
And it depends on how do we go about defining identities. But I was just wondering whether there's this kind of discussion.
With regards to social psychology, there is, I'm already kind of hinted at the broad distinction that there is in characterizes much of social psychological discussion is this broad distinction between the mainstream that is often referred to as social cognitivist social psychology and the constructionist social psychology, and that and social identity approach is very much a part of the former, the social cognitivist one. And here, with regard to social identity theory, there is relatively little discussion on, for example, how so there is this idea of social identity being both about the feeling of being a representative of a category and also of the meanings associated with the category. So that I'm Finn, and that also in my mind involves is associated with certain what it means, an idea of what it means to be a Finn. But there's relatively little discussion on where the meanings come from and how they change. So most of the research on social identity and in social identity theory is focusing on kind of the consequences of what happens when the social identities become active, so what are kind of the consequences of that for social interaction, for intergroup relations? And one does not pay that much attention to where what are the origins of the categories. And that is actually something that in my own work, my own dissertation was very much social constructionist in approach, and my own view is very much that these two large approaches within the social psychology could well supplement each other in this, that whereas the social identity approach speaks precious little about where the meanings associated with social categories come from, that's kind of the whole idea behind the social constructionist approach, is to investigate how identities, how meanings associated with certain identities are being negotiated and discussed and debated and all that. So that is perhaps more something that is the social constructionist scholars are discussing. But there's a lot of kind of to summarize. There's a lot of discussion on that and research on that, on how people construct meanings associated with social identities. I, for example, in my own dissertation studied when young Muslims talk about Finnishness and Muslimness, what do they mean by that? But that's kind of, that kind of research has taken place, has not been connected to research on social identity theory and intergroup relations that much. So they have grown these two fields of study rather separately.
Just to comment on that. So philosophically speaking, the question is really about social ontology. And the question of social ontology is quite heavily debated in philosophy and philosophy of social science in general. But the idea being, it has to do with the existence of various kinds of norms and statuses and things like that. So how do we understand those? The reason why I'm asking these questions in your case is that I want to know what kind of social ontological theories these psychological theories are committed to, or are they making assumptions about social ontology without really spelling them out? Because philosophically speaking, one could have a pretty robust theory of social ontology and say it's not a negotiation in any way whether you are a university researcher or not. It's a fact. It's a social fact that comes through because you're appointed as one. There's an appointment and there are certain criteria that have to be fulfilled. Like it's not a negotiation whether Sauli Niinistö is the president of Finland. That's a social fact. And that has to do with, and some social facts are a little bit more vague than others. And whether they are expressed in certain situations might be quite different from, they might change from situation to situation. But there's a certain kind of intersubjectivity or objectivity to many of our social categories. And someone like John Searle, or a philosopher who thinks about social relationships, things like that, could say, well, these are social facts. They change from time to time, but we can actually say truths about them. And then these truths, these sets of truths about social facts, make it such that one can be wrong about one's own identity, or one can pretend to be something and not be that, because there are procedures of finding out whether a person falls under a different category or something like that. So this kind of issue, this discussion of social ontology seems to be something that especially the social identity theory is not too much interested in doing, because it's focused on the mental representations that people have.
Exactly.
And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. That's all fine. But one just has to remember that there's this more general question about the existence of social categories, social norms, and the objectivity of those.
Yeah.
And that's not shouldn't be confused too quickly with this.
Yeah, exactly, and very good point. That is, I think that's definitely, altogether, I guess the epistemological and ontological questions are something that psychologists tend to reflect on too little. So that is not something that is being taken into account as much as it should, in my view. But altogether, of course, in psychological research, the main question relates to the ontological status of the psychological concepts that we are talking about. So what is kind of the ontological status of when I'm talking about psychology, for example, identity? And there the big distinction, at least when it comes to social psychology, is that with regard to social cognitivists, such as social identity theorists, they are very much something intrapsychic. They are intrapsychic cognitive structures or representations that are stored in the long-term memory. So they are something that take place inside your head. Whereas for discursivists, social constructionists, they are the things that are normally thought about as being intrapsychic are really intrapersonal. They're processes that are being negotiated in between us and that somehow take place in the interactions in between us. So that's kind of, yeah. There's a big kind of distinction between different social psychological approaches with regard to that.
I think there was still one question over there.
Yeah, I was wondering if Dr. Kuhns or you or someone else have thought about this. Is it possible to accept an in-group identification that all humans have been created by God? Is that kind of in-group definition acceptable, or is there a problem? Is it too loose in-group? Or something like that?
Good question. So there is certainly this idea in much of social identity theorizing on the hierarchy of social identities, that the different social identities seem to be hierarchically or organized, so that on one level I may perceive as myself as being a resident of Helsinki, and then a Finnish person, then a European, and then a global citizen, and then a human being, and so on and so forth. So theoretically, at least, that is possible, but it seems that there are certain social identities that are more likely to become active in the group context. So depending on these factors that have to do with the social identity salience, and most significantly, I'm here thinking about this comparative or normative fit. So definitely, even though we would have a social identity of being a human being or a person created by God or whatever, some kind of a very universal category, member of very universal category that unites us all, that is likely, that most definitely is not the only social identity we have, but besides that have all these other kinds of social categories. And
of discouraging racist behavior and actions. That was my thought on that.
Yeah. And that, I guess that kind of would fall under here, kind of an idea of re-categorization, finding for us as being divided into these different groups, finding some kind of a subordinate category that would unite us all. Theoretically, these approaches, these re-categorization approaches are very good. So theoretically, it seems that when people find some kind of an unifying identity that brings together these, that manages to unite them across these group boundaries, it seems to improve intergroup relationships. The problem with this is that they are quite hard to kind of, it seems hard to kind of create purposively these kinds of social, with top-down administrative procedures, these kind of identities. One good example that has been attempted in a number of national contexts, Britain most notably, in Finland there has been some discussion on this, especially among historians, is that is the kind of this construction of an inclusive national identity, so that the national category would be open to ethnic and religious diversity, for example. In Britain, this has been taken into consideration when, for example, planning the curriculum for schools, and for example, by emphasizing in history education the diverse roots of British people from all over the world, and so on and so forth. In Finland, historians have suggested that when, for example, teaching Finnish history in school, one should pay more attention to historical diversity in Finnish society, historical minorities and their presence in the Finnish context. But there have been all these kinds of attempts, but they seem not to be too successful in general. So the success seems to be rather limited. And what this what this means for me is that this people don't want to be defined from the top down. It's very hard to change people's self-perception with kind of administrative procedures. It would somehow need to grow from the bottom up and come about from the grassroots level, instead of kind of being attempted through curricular decisions or school teaching or that kind of things.
So our only hope of unity is finding a common enemy in extraterrestrial souls like
yeah, theoretically speaking.
On the note of Klingons, I think we'll close the session. Let me join me in thanking Teemu. So next we have a lunch break, and we're planning to go to what was the name of the restaurant? No, the Thai place first.
The other one, let's try it first.
The other one
it might be because it's new, so it's typical food.
Okay.
Try it first.
So we'll try the Thai place first, and then we go to Caverna after that. So follow me or roll it.
Would very much like to join.
Yes. And we'll be back at 1 o'clock.
I would very much like to join you for lunch, but I have to be in Zoom planning an academic proposal now. But I'll see you in the afternoon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.